So I'm going to do a little mini-series on Paul's first letter to the Corinthians this week and next week, beginning in chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. So, do you want proof for the existence of God? Incontestable proof. Consider the story of Mahmoud Gassama, an undocumented immigrant living in Paris for just 6 months, when he saw a crowd of people pointing up to a 4-year-old boy hanging desperately from life from the balcony there, and with no thought of his own safety, scaled the outside of that building to save the child. And if you know the rest of the story, honored by the President of France, given a fast trip ticket to citizenship in France. Well, not to be outdone, Rocky the Spider-Man raccoon, right, scaled a building 25 stories high in St. Paul, Minnesota, instantly becoming an internet sensation. People all around the world watching. And when asked why, after he made it to the top, Rocky reportedly told reporters he was just trying to get better cell reception. Right? That undocumented immigrants and city-dwelling raccoons can perform superhuman or super animal feats is hardly proof of God's existence. But think about those crowds, right? Strangers from all walks of life who just happened to be on the right street in Paris or St. Paul at that moment, cheering for Mahmoud Gassama and Rocky Raccoon, united in that moment of goodwill, polling or praying for a successful outcome. And no one said, wait, does that very black and obviously not very French man have a valid visa to be here? No one stereotyped the raccoon as a criminal, a gang member, or even an animal who should be shot. I mean, how could you, right? Something so cute. Everyone, regardless of race or creed or nationality or gender or political affiliation or sexual orientation, everyone in those brief moments were cheering for a safe outcome, cheering for the victory of life. I want to suggest to you, that's God at work. Now, maybe I'm odd. No need to agree with me. But I do not look for supernatural occurrences to explain God's existence. I look for the wonder of life, the awe of creation, the beauty of nature, the goodness of humanity. I look for love that overcomes hate, peace that wins over war, life that is stronger than death. Those are the signs and wonders that show me that God is still at work in this world. Now, I know there are many people who live by and for supernatural signs of God's existence and power, but not me. I'm a rational person. I want logic and reason. The insights of a wise person go a lot farther in my book than any nature-defying miracle. I resonate to reasonable explanations. Confront me with anything mysterious and my right brain goes into overload trying to make sense of it. I need religion that makes sense. Faith that doesn't require me to check my mind at the door when I enter. Now, I'm very aware some of us come to faith in God because something happened to us, a sign, a miracle, a light on the way to Damascus or Damish. And some of us become Christian because it just seemed like the right thing to do. Years ago, remember the Quaker Oats commercial? It's the right thing to do. I think of us as Quaker Oat Christians. It's just the right thing to do, right? So whatever your beliefs, however you came to faith, I think our image of God, in part, is shaped by the experience of how we became Christian. If it was through a sudden conversion, we are more apt then to see God as a worker of wonders. And we will likely see God's hand in that miraculous recovery of a loved one from a terminal condition, or the sudden change of a course of a storm, or the unexpected victory of our favorite sports team. But if we came to faith through gradual enlightenment, then likely we see God as a wielder of wisdom. And such a God is evident in the brilliant strokes of an artist, or the masterful writings of a great thinker, or the wise play selection of our favorite sports team. One sees God as all-knowing Father. Now, since this is Father's Day, right? Powerful, strong, mighty, someone like Frank writes, old and wise looking. The other sees God as wise, gentle, kind, able to put up with anything or anyone, like Donna writes. In all of our lives, we have been taught how God can be both mighty and gentle, all-powerful judge and all-forgiving redeemer, unchanging, absolute, beyond all things, and compassionate friend, present in all things, loving Father and strong Mother. Sometimes, perhaps most times, I think we're a little unsure which role God is taking right now in the present moment and where we stand, therefore, in our relationship to God. And into this somewhat disturbing dichotomy of dualistic divinity comes the Apostle Paul with an alternative vision of God, based neither in signs and wonders, nor in wisdom and reason. Now keep in mind, Paul is writing to a congregation that knows signs and wonders. The Corinthian church is filled with spiritual gifts of all kinds. They have healers, speakers of tongues, interpreters, prophets, miracle workers. Throw in a couple of clowns, and you could either have an instant circus or a day in the life of the U.S. Congress, right? Corinthians know signs and wonders. Corinth is also a church that knows wisdom. They're blessed with all kinds of knowledge associated with wisdom. And of course, knowledge is worthless unless you share it with others. And therefore, those with the gift of wisdom feel obligated to enlighten others frequently, right? With their wisdom. You know the type, right? That self-appointed expert who knows all the secrets of success. If you just give them an hour or two of their time and perhaps $5,000, they'll enlighten you. Explains why we're all so miserable, because after all, it's a secret. Duh. So the Corinthians know wisdom, or at least they think they do. Paul writes in chapter 8, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge. The end result is that this church, filled with spiritual gifts and wisdom of all sorts, could not agree on what to serve for dinner. Right? Donald Trump and Robert Mueller would be happier living together than the Corinthians were. The problem in Corinth is not a lack of talent. They have all the talent they can use. It's not lack of knowledge. They know too much already. It's not lack of leaders. They have too many from which to choose. Nor is it a lack of desire and faith. They are like Christians everywhere, earnestly desiring to do the right thing. And it's certainly not a lack of spirit. They have enough spirit to turn the senior citizens at Cascade Manor into a Black Baptist gospel choir. The primary issue instead is a theological one, and it stems from their misconceptions of how God works in the world. Does God work wonders and miracles? Well, undeniably, though the rational side of me still questions the supernatural variety. Does God use reason and wisdom? Unquestionably, and certainly divine wisdom will include a bit of mystery. But the primary manifestation of God is neither of those things, according to Paul. The primary testimony to God's character, he says, is a stumbling block to the seekers of signs and foolishness to the pursuers of wisdom. For the greatest revelation of God is embedded in the cross, a symbol that struck terror in the hearts of people throughout the Roman Empire. Paul proclaims the death of God's chosen child on this instrument of oppression as the greatest revelation of God. Now, some may protest, surely it's not greater than the Exodus, when the entire Hebrew nation was liberated from slavery under the mighty Pharaoh, crossing the Red Sea, manna in the wilderness, encountering God in Mount Sinai, and all of that, surely not greater than that. Others will cite the birth of Jesus, the miraculous conceptions, angels appearing to shepherds, magi led by a star. Surely the cross cannot surpass the miracle of the birth of Jesus. And what about all those miracles? The feeding of the crowds, the healing of the blind, the crippled, the casting out the demons, the walking on the water, the raising of Lazarus. Does the cross reveal more about God than miracles? Paul says, yes, it does. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He writes in the very next chapter. Well then, how about the resurrection? Are we not an Easter people? Is not the resurrection the ultimate testimony to the power of God? And I would certainly say it is. But Paul oddly makes no mention of the resurrection until he gets to chapter 6. 6 times he refers to the cross and the crucifixion before he says anything of that event that we celebrate as the beginning of Christianity. So do you suppose it just sort of slipped Paul's mind? That he really meant to say that it was the empty tomb which shows the power of God? Or could it possibly be there's a time and place to proclaim Christ crucified separate and apart from proclaiming Christ arisen? Yes, there can be no resurrection without death, but can there be Easter without crucifixion? In other words, it's not just that Jesus died, but that he was crucified by the powers that be, that shows the ultimate folly of God that is greater than our wisdom. Just that phrase, Christ crucified, would have struck anyone in the first century as an oxymoron of the highest order. And we often forget Christ is not the last name of Jesus, right? Christ is the title, Messiah. A crucified Messiah makes as much sense as a round square or a legal crime or an honest lie. If you were crucified, you couldn't be the Messiah. And if you were the Messiah, you wouldn't be crucified. So Paul is making a claim not only for Jesus, Paul is making a claim about God that turns human logic upside down. God is present, not in the victory, but the defeat. Not in the powerful, but in the weak. Not in the king on the throne, but the crucified on the cross. And truth be known, I think it's hard to get too excited about a theology of the cross. We much prefer to center our faith on the resurrection because there's joy and excitement, right, on Easter morning. That's why the church is so full and typically empty, right, for Good Friday. Avery and Marsh taught us cheerfully to sing that kitschy song of the 70s. Every morning is Easter morning from now on. So you remember that, right? Every day is resurrection day. The past is over and gone. That was a fun song. We don't sing it much anymore. But Paul reminds us that celebrating resurrection without the cross results in triumphalism and a distorted view of God. Sign seekers, you see, stumble over the cross on their rush to get to the empty tomb where the true glory of God is revealed. Pursuers of wisdom are stymied by the absurdity of a crucified Lord. Crosses and crowns are contradictions, logical opposites. And precisely because the cross is a stumbling block to the seekers of signs and foolishness to the wise, we deny it, we hide it, we cover it up, we decorate it in gold or flowers, right? As Protestants, we say we prefer an empty cross to the Catholic crucifix because the empty cross symbolizes resurrection. And that's true, but I wonder if it's also because we are bothered by that notion of Christ's suffering or even God's suffering. So we don't want to be confronted by it. We don't want to see the crucified Jesus. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned our sister church in Washington, D.C., National City Christian Church, where Stephen Gentle is the pastor. And I was seated next to Steve when he was the pastor at First Christian Church of Orlando, Florida, when John Dominic Crossan was preaching to a crowd of clergy from across the nation. And hanging behind him there in that church, this was the Easter season, post-Easter, was a large banner of the resurrected Jesus with outstretched arms. And Dom, to make his point about the importance of not separating the crucified Jesus from the risen Christ, pointed to the very unblemished hands of the risen Jesus and said, "Whenever I see images of the risen Christ without the wounds of the cross, I get very nervous. For it is precisely when we forget the crucifixion of Christ by Pilate that we make persecution of others by Christians possible." Steve, sinking low in the pew, whispered to me, "I think I'm going to go get a red magic marker and I'll fix the banner during the break." We much prefer, you see, resurrection to crucifixion, life to death, joy to suffering. Paul, however, writing to the Spirit-filled, wisdom-boasting congregation, speaks only of Christ crucified as the definitive revelation of God's character and power. Consider your calling, he tells the Corinthians. Remember your roots. You once were nobodies, and God has made you a somebody. God gave you dignity in a society that treats you as trash. God raised you up after others beat you down. God brought you life in a world surrounded by death. This is the power of the cross that turns the last into the first, the victim into the victor, the cross into the crown, the tomb of Christ into the womb of God. And what did the Corinthians do with their new God-given status? Paul writes very sarcastically in chapter 4, "Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Quite apart from us, you have become kings. We are fools for the sake of Christ, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute." Have you ever noticed how often the oppressed become the oppressor when given power? And see, that's what happens, as Cross told us in Orlando, when we forget the cross. And so Paul chides his readers. To the present hour, we are hungry and thirsty. We are poorly clothed and beaten and homeless. We grow weary from the work of our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we speak kindly. We have become like the rubbish of the world, the dregs of all things to this very day. And then Paul pleads, "I appeal to you then, be imitators of me. And this is certainly the greatest foolishness of all. Paul, hungry, homeless, poorly clothed, weak, persecuted, beaten, slandered, would consider himself worthy of emulation. Can we, well-fed, clothed, housed people of God, tolerate a theology of the cross? Do we need the foolishness of God to correct the wisdom of our world? Will we take the bittersweet wine of the cross to dull our thirst for power and signs? Do we need the reminder that salvation is not the result of what we do, it's what God does? Are we willing to spend more time, money, and effort lifting up the weak, the low, and despised, rather than making it to the top ourselves? Paul says, the Spirit-filled, knowledge-bloated people of Corinth need such a theology to restore them to their faith, to guide them in their walk. I could be mistaken, but I suspect these words are meant for us too. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all.